This is still part of the endocrine system, and we're going to be talking about the pancreas and the hormones that it releases. Now, the pancreas is this long, slender organ, most of which is going to be located posterior to the bottom half of the stomach. So the stomach will sit on top, or anterior, I should say, to the pancreas. It is what we call a mixed gland, as it will have both exocrine and endocrine activities. And although its primarily function is to secrete a variety of digestive enzymes and therefore act as an exocrine gland, the pancreas has very important endocrine functions. We will cover the pancreas exocrine functions once we get to the digestive system, but for now we will focus on its endocrine functions. Therefore, the endocrine functions consist of a small group of cells that are scattered throughout the gland. This group of cells are called pancreatic islets or islets of Langerhans. Now, this scientist Langerhans was very busy, right? Remember that we had the Langerhans cells in the skin as well, which functions as macrophages. Remember this from the integumentary system? Well, anyway, each of these islets, they will contain 4 major cell types. We have the alpha cells, the beta cells, the delta cells, and the PP cells, which can also be referred to as F cells, or even gamma cells, but lately it has been referred to as PP cells. First, let's talk about the alpha cells, which make up about 20% of each islet. What will it do? Well, it produces the hormone glucagon that helps in the regulation of blood sugar. Low blood sugar glucose levels will stimulate the release of this hormone. Therefore, it will basically break down glycogen, which is just the stored form of glucose that's made up of many connected glucose molecules, and it will give rise to valuable glucose to be used by the body as energy. On the other hand, we have the beta cells that produces the hormone insulin and makes up approximately 75% of each islet. So most of the islets are made up of beta cells. And elevated blood glucose levels will stimulate the release of insulin. So it's the opposite of the alpha cells, which will then combine the molecules of glucose back up and build glycogen and store it. And where is glycogen going to be stored? If you said skeletal muscles and liver, you are correct. Great job. Now the delta cells, they account for about 4% of the islet cells, and they secrete the peptide hormone known as somatostatin. Recall that somatostatin is also released by the hypothalamus as the growth hormone inhibitory hormone. And in addition, the stomach and the intestines will also secrete somatostatin. So this is going to be an inhibiting hormone. Pancreatic somatostatin, therefore, will inhibit the release of both glucagon and insulin. So that's how it will control the levels of sugar in your body. Lastly, we have the PP cells. PP will stand for pancreatic polypeptide hormone, and it accounts for about 1% of the islet cells. This hormone inhibits gallbladder contractions and also regulates the production of some of the pancreatic enzymes, and in return, it will help to control the rate of nutrient absorption by the digestive tract. If your body is inhibiting pancreatic enzymes and the release of bile from the gallbladder, this will slow down food breakdown, because both the pancreatic enzymes and the bile coming from the gallbladder help with food breakdown, and therefore this will then lead to the decrease in nutrient absorption. Therefore, just to summarize, we can say that glucagon and insulin both will regulate the rate of glucose metabolism. If you have the need to have more sugar circulating in your body, more glucose, then glucagon will get the glycogen that's being stored in the muscle cells and in the liver, and it will break it down into glucose. If you have too much glucose circulating, then the insulin will build it back up and store it back up as glycogen. Let's look here how we're going to regulate the blood glucose levels. We all know that glucose is going to be required for cellular respiration, and it's actually the preferred fuel for all body cells. And the body derives glucose from the breakdown of the carbohydrate containing foods and drinks that we consume. And glucose that is not immediately taken up by the cells for fuel can be stored by the liver and muscles as glycogen. Or it can also be converted into triglycerides, and then it will be stored in the adipose tissue instead of being stored in the muscles and in the liver. And what are triglycerides? Well, triglycerides are going to be a type of fat or lipid that's found in your blood. And when you eat, your body converts any calories it doesn't need to use right away into triglycerides. And later, the hormones release triglycerides to be used as energy. So hormones regulate both the storage and the utilization of glucose as they feel that is needed. And receptors that are located in the pancreas sense the blood glucose levels, and subsequently the pancreatic cells, they're going to secrete either glucagon or insulin to maintain normal levels. Therefore, we can say that blood glucose concentration is tightly maintained between 70 milligrams per deciliter up to 110 milligrams per deciliter. And if blood glucose concentration drops below this range, then glucagon is going to be released, which will stimulate the body cells to release glucose into the blood. And now, if blood glucose concentration rises above this range, insulin is released, which stimulates body cells to remove glucose from the blood. If you have elevated blood glucose, we call it hyperglycemia. If you have low blood glucose, we call it hypoglycemia. So let's take a look at this chart and we can see exactly how this will be regulated. So receptors in the pancreas, like I said, they're going to sense the decline in blood glucose levels, such as during periods of fasting. So if you stay a long period of time without eating, or when you're doing a lot of exercise. And in response, the alpha cells of the pancreas secrete the hormone glucagon, which has several effects. First, we can say that it inhibits the cells in your body from utilizing glucose that is going to be circulating in the blood to be used in cellular respiration, which makes sense since you want to conserve as much glucose as possible, right? So you want to prevent it from being wasted. It stimulates the liver to convert its stores of glycogen back into glucose. So this response is known as glycogenolysis. And the glucose is then released into the circulation for use by the body cells. Next, glucagon will stimulate the liver to take up amino acids from the blood and convert them into glucose. And this response is known as gluconeogenesis. So the formation of new glucose. Neo is new. And last, it stimulates lipolysis, which is the breakdown of stored triglycerides into free fatty acids and glycerol. And some of the free glycerol that's released into the bloodstream will travel to the liver, which then converts it into glucose. And this is also a form of gluconeogenesis. So this is why I placed lipolysis under the gluconeogenesis tab. Therefore, taken together, these actions increase blood glucose levels, and the activity of glucagon is going to be regulated through a negative feedback mechanism. Therefore, rising blood glucose levels inhibit further glucagon production and secretion. in addition to the action of somatostatin, which is secreted by the delta cells. Then we have insulin, which is the primary function of this hormone is to facilitate the uptake of glucose into body cells. So it's going to be the opposite of glucagon. Red blood cells, as well as cells of the brain, the liver, kidneys, and the lining of the small intestine, they do not have insulin receptors on their cell membranes, and they do not require insulin for glucose uptake, although all other body cells do require insulin if they are to take glucose from the bloodstream. In fact, skeletal muscle cells and adipose cells are going to be the primary targets of insulin. Let's say it is lunchtime and you start to eat your meal. The presence of food in the intestine will trigger the release of gastrointestinal tract hormones such as glucose-dependent insulin-tropic peptide, which was previously known as gastric inhibitory peptide. And this is in turn the initial trigger for insulin production by the beta cells of the pancreas. Now, digestion is occurring while you're still eating, correct? Yes, correct. Especially if digestion already starts to occur when the food is still in your mouth. And we will cover more about this when we get to the digestive system. But eventually your food will be broken down and reach the small intestine, where the nutrients will start to be absorbed. And once nutrient absorption occurs, the resulting surge or increase in blood glucose levels will further stimulate insulin secretion. So circulating insulin triggers the rapid movement of a pool of glucose transporter vesicles to the cell membrane, where they will fuse and expose the glucose transporters to the extracellular fluid. The transporters will then move glucose by facilitated diffusion into the cell interior, where it will get stored. Therefore, the opposite will occur in the presence of insulin. Insulin will inhibit the use of glucose in cellular respiration. It will inhibit glycogenolysis and, in addition, gluconeogenesis. So it's the opposite of glucagon. We can't talk about the endocrine function of the pancreas without mentioning diabetes. So diabetes mellitus occurs when we are not building up or storing glucose and glycogen like we were supposed to be doing. Therefore, there's going to be a dysfunction of insulin production and secretion, as well as the target cell's responsiveness to insulin. So instead, glucose is going to be running all over our body because the insulin is not being used or produced like it should. And because of that, we have what's called eye, nerve, kidney disease. That's sort of like a catchy phrase that's used in medicine to describe diabetes. And why is that? Well, over time, too much glucose circulating, we are unable to see very well. The nerves, most commonly in our feet, are unable to sense stimuli, and you actually start to feel sensations like stings and pricks, and this can cause damage to your feet and leg, and eventually can cause the need to have an amputation. And kidneys stop working over time, and this can lead to dialysis, and dialysis usually leads to early death. And because glucose is circulating all over our body, it causes several other serious diseases, like, for example, heart disease and many, many more complications, of which we will really not address here. But just remember that it affects your vision, it affects your nerves, and it will definitely affect the function of your kidney. Now, this is an increasingly common disease that has been diagnosed in more than 18 million adults in the United States and more than 200,000 children, which is sort of sad, right? Especially because it can be preventable. And it is estimated that up to 7 million more adults have this condition, but they have not been diagnosed yet. And in addition, approximately 79 million people in the US are estimated to have what we call a pre-diabetes condition, in which the blood glucose levels are abnormally high, but not yet high enough to be classified as diabetes. So if they don't take action, this might lead them to have diabetes. There are two main types or forms of diabetes mellitus. Type 1 diabetes is what we call an autoimmune disease that's actually going to be affecting the beta cells of the pancreas. So since this is an autoimmune disease, it means that you are actually born with this condition. And studies have recognized specific genes to increase the susceptibility of an individual having type 1 diabetes. Therefore, if the beta cells are the ones that are being affected in type 1 diabetes, this means that these individuals, they do not produce insulin at all. And we know how important it is to control the levels of glucose. Therefore, these individuals not only have to make sure they control the amount of sugar they eat, but they also must administer synthetic insulin by injection or by infusion. And this form of diabetes accounts for less than 5% of all diabetes cases. Therefore, type 2 diabetes accounts for approximately 95% of all cases, and it is what we call an acquired disease. This means that you are not born with it. You acquire it. You make yourself develop it. And how are you able to do this to yourself? Well, lifestyle factors such as poor diet, inactivity, and the presence of prediabetes greatly increases a person's risk of developing type 2. About 80 to 90% of people with type 2 diabetes, they are overweight or obese. And what is the physiology behind type 2 diabetes? Well, the cells, they become resistant to the effects of insulin. This means that even though insulin is circulating throughout your body to try to reduce the blood sugar, the cells in your body are ignoring the circulating insulin. And in response, the pancreas increases its insulin secretion. But the bad thing is that over time, the beta cells, they become exhausted because they're trying to produce so much insulin. They're like talking to themselves. What is going on here? I am tired of producing insulin and you're ignoring it. So they become exhausted. The great news is that in many cases, type 2 diabetes can be reversed by a combination of moderate weight loss, regular physical activity, and consumption of a healthy diet. However, if blood glucose levels cannot be controlled, then the person with diabetes will eventually require insulin. Like I said earlier, there are an estimated 7 million people that have type 2 diabetes but have not been diagnosed yet. Two of the early manifestations of type 2 diabetes are excessive urination and excessive thirst. Now, they do demonstrate how the out of control levels of glucose in the blood will affect the kidneys' function. The kidneys are responsible for filtering glucose from the blood, and excessive blood glucose will draw the water into the urine and therefore eliminate it from the body. So as a result, the person eliminates abnormally large quantities of sweet urine. In fact, one of the ways that you can see if you have diabetes is by tasting the urine, which I'm not suggesting you do, but that is a possibility. And the use of body water to dilute the urine leaves the body dehydrated. And so the person is going to be unusually and continually thirsty. So the person may also experience persistent hunger because the body cells, they are unable to access the glucose in the bloodstream. So make sure to keep those symptoms in mind. If you encounter somebody that might be going through those symptoms, or if you start to experience those symptoms, then make sure to get tested.